You really thought those papers you signed at 19 would stay buried forever? I transferred controlling interest of your little concierge service to my daughter and your husband this morning. The notarized agreement scan is already filed and binding, silent, clean, and completely legal. You built it, but we own it now. Time you learned your place in this family, once and for all. Hi, my name is Skylar Brooks. I am 26 years old. I sat across the polished oak table in the formal study of the suburban compound outside Bentonville, Arkansas, and felt the words settle into my bones like ice water. My mother-in-law had delivered them without raising her voice, without a single dramatic gesture, just that flat, practiced certainty she always used when she knew she held the cards. The rest of the family was gathered for what she had called an urgent financial alignment meeting. My husband sat to my left, staring at the grain of the wood. My father-in-law leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed, looking mildly bored. And my sister-in-law, seated directly across from me, wore the smallest, most satisfied smile I had ever seen. I did not flinch. I did not argue. I simply picked up the glass of water in front of me and took a slow sip while the silence stretched. Inside, though, something cold and precise clicked into place. This was the moment everything I had quietly protected for 7 years finally met the people who had always believed they could take it. My mother-in-law continued as if reciting from a script she had rehearsed for months. The business needed stable leadership. You have been distracted with your little side projects and your refusal to involve the family. My daughter has the vision to scale it properly. Your husband will handle the finances. It is done. My sister-in-law leaned forward, manicured nails tapping once against the table. We are keeping you on as a consultant, of course. Part-time. It will give you more time to support the family the way you should have been doing all along. My husband cleared his throat but said nothing. He had known. Of course he had known. The realization landed without heat, just another fact in the ledger I was already balancing in my head. I set the glass down. Which documents exactly did you use? My voice came out even almost curious. My mother-in-law slid a single sheet of paper across the table, a scanned copy of a notarized agreement from when I was 19. Back then, I had been desperate for seed money and guidance. She had offered both in exchange for her name on the initial formation papers as advisor and co-founder. I had paid her back every cent within 18 months and assumed the loose language would never matter. I had been wrong. Silent partner rights, my mother-in-law said, tapping the page, activated when the business reached a certain valuation. You never updated the operating agreement to remove me. Careless, really? I studied the scan. The ink was crisp, the notary stamp clear. No forgery, just an old forgotten door I had never thought to lock twice. The betrayal was not loud or theatrical. It was paperwork, clean, patient, and utterly final. That was when my phone buzzed once against my thigh. I glanced down under the table. A text from my colleague at the premium supplier we used for the high-end relocation packages. He wrote that something weird had just come across his desk on the banking side, a large transfer authorization request tied to an old co-founder clause. He asked if I had seen this. I did not reply. Not yet. The timing was almost poetic. My father-in-law finally spoke, voice gruff but detached. It is for the best. The family sticks together. You have done well for a young woman, but you do not have the experience to run something this size alone anymore. My sister-in-law added, sweet as poison. Besides, with the new baby coming next spring, I will need the income stream to stay home and focus on what matters. I felt the words land, but they did not sting the way they once would have. Instead, they sharpened the cold clarity I was already carrying. This was not about the business. This was about control, about reminding me exactly where I ranked in the family hierarchy. I kept my face neutral. I see. My mother-in-law's eyes narrowed slightly, searching for the crack she expected. There was none. I had spent the last few years learning exactly how to become unreadable to her. The meeting dragged on for another 40 minutes of polite discussion about transition plans, new branding directions my sister-in-law wanted to explore, and how I could ease out gracefully. I listened, nodded at the right moments, and said almost nothing. My husband kept glancing at me, something uneasy in his expression, but he stayed silent. My father-in-law checked his watch twice. Only my sister-in-law seemed genuinely excited, already sketching notes on a legal pad like she had been waiting for this day for years. When my mother-in-law finally stood, signaling the end, I rose with her. One question, I said, still calm. Did you run any of this by the current operating agreement, or was it purely the old advisor clause? My mother-in-law smiled the way people smile when they think they have won. The clause was sufficient. Everything else is just details we will clean up next week. I nodded once. Understood. As the family filed out of the study into the wide hallway of the compound home, my phone buzzed again. Another message from my colleague. He had checked the routing. This transfer request was trying to pull operating capital into a new holding account under my sister-in-law's name. He also flagged some old personal withdrawals from my early accounts that never got documented. He asked if I wanted him to dig deeper. I slipped the phone into my pocket without answering. The first thread of the larger picture was pulling loose, and I could already see where it led. Later that evening, back in the smaller guest house on the far edge of the compound where my husband and I lived, I sat at my desk and opened the secure folder I had kept for years. My trusted advisor, who handled all my personal legal work, had helped me maintain it. I forwarded the text to her with a single line, asking her to look into everything. Her reply came almost immediately. She was on it. This smelled like more than one old clause. She told me to stand by. I closed the laptop and stared at the dark screen. My mother-in-law had just handed me the exact lever I had been waiting for without realizing it. The business was mine. Truly mine in ways the old paperwork could never touch. But I was not going to explain that yet. Not while they still believed they had me cornered. My husband came in from the main house, loosening his collar. That was intense, he said quietly. My mom seemed pretty set on this. I looked at him for a long moment, the man I had married 3 years ago, thinking we were building something real together. She did. He waited for more. I offered nothing. The cold detachment I felt was not anger. It was the clean space that forms when you finally stop hoping the people who are supposed to protect you will ever choose you. The next morning, my colleague called while I was reviewing client contracts in my small home office. His voice was low urgent. Skylar, I pulled the full transaction history on that authorization request. There are 4 undocumented withdrawals over the past 14 months from the operating account. They were routed through a personal account your mother-in-law set up years ago as the original advisor. Small at first, then bigger. One matches the exact week my sister-in-law needed that down payment on her new vehicle. Another lines up with what looks like a family trip they took last summer. These were framed as loans or advances back when you were still building the concierge service from your apartment, but they were never repaid or logged properly in the books. This silent transfer is trying to bury them under new ownership. I listened without interrupting the detached calm I had carried since the study meeting holding steady. Send the full trail to my advisor, I told him, voice even, and flag anything else that ties back to those early years. I need the complete picture before anyone pushes this handover further. He hesitated on the line. You want me to hold off on alerting the bank for now, I said. This stays between us and my advisor until I say otherwise. I ended the call and stared at the screen for a long moment. The childhood secrets were resurfacing in the coldest way possible, not as old memories, but as hard ledger entries. My mother-in-law had always positioned herself as the helpful guide when I was 19, fresh out of community college, and scraping together the first clients for what would become the concierge service. Those small transfers she had made back then had come with strings I had never fully examined, strings she was now yanking tight under the guise of family alignment. The notarized agreement scan had been only the visible tip. The real leverage ran deeper through years of quiet financial threads she had woven into my operations. My advisor called an hour later, her tone brisk and professional as always. She had reviewed the files my colleague sent. The silent partner clause was legitimate on paper, but those withdrawals created a separate trail of potential fiduciary issues. More importantly, she had found a secondary notarized addendum dated 6 months ago that my mother-in-law had tried to file without my knowledge. It expanded her advisor rights to include asset pledges. She had been preparing this move long before yesterday's meeting, but here was the part that changed things. My later amendments from 2 years ago, the ones we filed quietly after that big corporate contract win, created a protective layer my mother-in-law never saw. The business itself was shielded in ways the old paperwork could not touch. Still, if they pushed the transfer through without full disclosure, it triggered automatic review clauses that could expose everything. I absorbed the information the way I had learned to absorb bad news without reaction, without heat. How long until they realize the transfer is not as clean as they think? 48 hours at most, once the formal filing hits the state portal, my advisor said. The colleague uncover is already giving us the ammunition. But Skylar, this is going to get personal fast. Those early withdrawals tied directly to family expenses they never disclosed to you. I thanked her and set the phone down. The mid-story twist was unfolding exactly as the numbers demanded, not with drama but with the quiet weight of documented facts. My mother-in-law had triggered a full confession of sorts by trying to seize control, but she had no idea the trail led straight back to her own careful manipulations. That afternoon, my husband came home early from his shift at the logistics firm, his face tight with the kind of unease he could never quite hide. He found me in the small office off the guest house living room, reviewing client timelines for the next wave of executive relocations. My mom called me on my way home, he said, dropping his keys on the counter. She wants us all at the main house tonight to go over the transition details. My sister-in-law is already there planning the new branding rollout. My dad thinks it is best if we just get it done smoothly. I looked up from the screen, keeping my expression neutral. Smoothly. My husband shifted his weight, running a hand through his hair. Look, I know this feels sudden, but my mom has been talking about family stability for months. With my sister-in-law expecting and everything, it makes sense to have more hands on deck. You have carried the business alone long enough. The words landed with the familiar dull thud of someone who had already chosen his side without admitting it. My husband had watched me build the concierge service from late-night client calls and handwritten proposal packets, yet here he was, echoing the same narrative my mother-in-law had fed the family for years. I did not argue. I simply closed the laptop and stood. I will be there. The main house felt heavier that evening, the wide living room lit by the same recessed lights my mother-in-law favored for these gatherings. She was already seated at the head of the long table when we arrived, a fresh stack of printed documents in front of her. My sister-in-law sat to her right, scrolling through design mock-ups on her tablet with that satisfied glow she wore whenever she sensed an advantage. My father-in-law occupied the far end, flipping through a golf magazine as if the conversation had not yet started. My mother-in-law did not waste time on pleasantries. The formal transfer paperwork goes to the state office tomorrow morning. My daughter and your husband will assume day-to-day operations immediately. You can stay on payroll for the next quarter as a senior consultant while you adjust. It is generous, really, considering how long you have been running things your way. My sister-in-law glanced up, her smile sharp. We will keep the name, of course, but we are rebranding the service packages to focus on premium family relocation bundles. Corporate clients are nice, but the real money is in the repeat residential moves. I have already reached out to a few of your bigger contacts to introduce the new structure. The jab landed clean-laced with the same long-held resentment my mother-in-law had always directed at my independence. I felt the physical shift in my shoulders, a small tightening that I refused to show. Which contacts exactly? I asked, voice level. My mother-in-law's eyes narrowed slightly. The ones who matter. The ones who have been asking why the business never expanded faster. Now that we are in charge, we can fix that. My mother-in-law leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing in that way that always signaled she was about to deliver the real point. You built something useful, but you have always been too stubborn to share the load. This is what family does. We step in when someone is spread too thin. You should be thanking us for taking the pressure off. The sarcasm was subtle, the kind that had always cut deeper than outright anger, reminding me of every quiet suggestion over the years that I was not quite capable on my own. My husband sat beside me, silent again, his hand resting on the table but never reaching for mine. My father-in-law cleared his throat once, but said nothing. I let the silence stretch just long enough. I see the plan. My mother-in-law's expression flickered a brief flash of irritation at my lack of fight. She had expected tears or protests, the same reactions she had received from me in my early 20s when she had first inserted herself into the business. Good. Then we can move forward without drama. The notary will be here at 10 tomorrow to witness the signatures. Another mini cliffhanger hung in the air as she slid the new stack of documents toward me, the top page showing the same scanned, notarized agreement from yesterday, but now with fresh addendums highlighted. I scanned the lines without picking them up. The financial trail my colleague had uncovered was about to intersect with this moment in ways none of them could predict. Later that night, back in the guest house, my advisor's name lit up my phone again. I answered on the first ring. The addendum you mentioned earlier has a problem, she said without preamble. It references asset pledges that overlap with the protective amendments we filed. More critically, one of the early withdrawals my colleague flagged matches a personal expense your mother-in-law covered for my sister-in-law back when you were still repaying those initial gifts. It was never a loan from her personal funds. It was pulled from the business operating account you thought was clean. The paper trail is ironclad now. If they file tomorrow, the state review will trigger an automatic audit flag within 72 hours. I exhaled slowly, the detached calm holding. The crisis my mother-in-law had triggered with her full confession of intent was accelerating, pulling in every secret she had tried to keep buried. Hold the line with my colleague. I want everything documented and time-stamped before any signatures happen. My advisor paused. Skylar, this is going to blow up the family dynamic completely once it surfaces. Are you prepared for that? I looked across the darkened room toward the main house lights still glowing in the distance. I have been prepared for years. The call ended, but the weight of the next 48 hours pressed in like a held breath. My mother-in-law believed she had executed a flawless silent asset transfer, but the colleague who had uncovered the financial trail was about to hand me the one piece of evidence that would force every hidden thread into the open. I set the phone down and sat in the quiet, waiting for the moment they realized the paperwork they had forced on me was about to expose far more than they had bargained for. The next morning, the main house felt heavier than usual as we gathered in the formal study again. My mother-in-law had arranged the same polished oak table, the same stack of fresh documents centered like a verdict. My sister-in-law sat with her tablet open, already outlining new service packages, as if the handover was a foregone conclusion. My husband took the chair beside me, his posture stiff. My father-in-law stood by the window, arms crossed, checking his watch with the detached impatience he reserved for anything that interrupted his routine. My mother-in-law did not bother with pleasantries. She slid the top document toward me, her voice flat and precise. Sign here. The notary arrives in 20 minutes. My daughter and your husband will take over operations effective immediately. This is the cleanest way forward for everyone. My sister-in-law leaned in, her smile thin. We've already updated the client portal with the new structure. Some of your long-term contacts have been asking why growth stalled. Now we can fix that properly. The jab landed with the familiar cold edge my mother-in-law had always used, the one that reminded me I had never quite measured up to the family standard. I kept my hands folded on the table, voice even. Which contacts exactly have you spoken to? My mother-in-law's eyes narrowed slightly. The ones who matters. The corporate accounts you have been too cautious with. You built something useful from nothing, but you have always been too independent for your own good. This transfer corrects that. Sign the papers. I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I glanced at my phone as it vibrated once on the table. My colleague's name flashed. I answered on speaker, keeping my tone detached. Go ahead. My colleague's voice came through clear and professional. Skylar, the full transaction history is complete. 4 undocumented withdrawals from the operating account over the last 14 months routed through the advisor-linked personal account. The amounts match personal expenses tied to my sister-in-law down payment on her vehicle that family trip last summer, even some of the nursery setup costs. They were pulled under the old clause without any corresponding loan documentation or repayment entries. If the transfer proceeds today, those become part of the new ownership liabilities. The room went still. My sister-in-law's fingers froze on her tablet. My husband shifted beside me but said nothing. My father-in-law turned from the window, brow furrowed. My mother-in-law recovered first, her voice laced with the same cold sarcasm she had used the day before. Those were family advances. You were 19 when the business started. I helped you when no one else would. Do not twist helpful support into something ugly now. I met her gaze without flinching. Helpful support that was never logged or repaid. The trail shows they came straight from the operating account I thought I controlled. My advisor's follow-up text appeared on my screen at the same moment. I read it aloud, voice steady. The protective amendments filed 2 years ago after the major corporate contract create an automatic review trigger on any ownership change. The silent asset transfer you initiated now exposes the undocumented withdrawals. The state portal will flag it within 72 hours, and the business structure I updated routes all intellectual property and client contracts through a separate holding layer you never had access to. The old notarized agreement scan gives you nothing but liability for those past transactions. My sister-in-law's face flushed. Mom, what is this? You said the paperwork was clean. You said this would secure everything for the baby and the family. My mother-in-law's composure cracked just enough for the resentment to show. It was clean until she started playing these games. Skylar has always been difficult, always holding the business like it was her personal fortress instead of something the family could share. Those withdrawals were necessary. You needed the support. My father-in-law cleared his throat. This is getting messy. We do not need audits or flags right now. My husband finally spoke, voice low. Skylar, you knew about the withdrawals. I looked at him for the first time that morning, the detachment settling deeper. I know the full picture now. The confrontation sharpened. My sister-in-law turned on my mother-in-law, voice rising. You used the business account for my expenses without telling anyone. I thought those were gifts from you and my dad. My mother-in-law's reply was ice. They were family support. Skylar owed us that much after everything we did to get her started. I stood slowly, the patient, unyielding calm I had carried for years, finally anchoring every word. I paid back every cent of the original seed money. I updated the structure quietly because I learned early that sharing the load with this family meant losing control. The silent asset transfer you forced is now your problem. I will not sign anything new. The business remains protected. You can explain the undocumented withdrawals to the state reviewer yourself. My mother-in-law's eyes flashed with the long-held contempt that had always simmered beneath her measured tone. You are walking away from your own family. After everything we have done for you, I picked up my phone, the final thread of the crisis she had triggered snapping into place. I am choosing the structure I built to protect what matters. You can keep the old paperwork and the liabilities it carries. I am done carrying the weight of pretending this was ever mutual. My husband reached for my arm but stopped short when I stepped back. My sister-in-law stared at the documents as if they had betrayed her. My father-in-law shook his head once, already distancing himself from the mess. No one followed me as I left the study. I walked the short path back to the guest house, alone, the compound's quiet paths unchanged around me. The confrontation had ended, not with explosive anger, but with the clean finality of boundaries drawn in ink and numbers. My mother-in-law had tried to seize control through a silent asset transfer, and the colleague who uncovered the financial trail had handed me the exact evidence that forced her hand into the open. Childhood secrets, the quiet extractions she had always framed as generosity, now sat exposed in the ledger she could no longer hide. Inside the guest house, I closed the door and sat at my desk, the silence settling around me like a deliberate choice. My husband would likely stay in the main house tonight, the way he always did when the family dynamic pulled harder than our marriage. Some of the close professional relationships I had built through the business would shift or fade once the ownership question surfaced publicly. The isolation was not dramatic. It was simply the space that remained when I stopped trying to earn approval from people who had never truly seen me. I felt unsettled in the quiet, the way a long-held tension finally releases and leaves an unfamiliar emptiness behind. Yet beneath it sat a quiet empowerment, the knowledge that I had released the toxic family guilt I had carried since 19. No longer would I measure my worth by how well I absorbed their expectations or how quietly I rebuilt what they tried to claim. The business would continue under the protections I had built, and I would continue under the same patient, unyielding terms I had set for myself years ago. Peace over pretense. Boundaries over belonging. That evening, the compound lights glowed in the distance, but I kept my own space dark and still. The defiant peace I had chosen was not loud or triumphant. It was the steady absence of their voices, the freedom that came from finally letting the paperwork and the secrets do what they were always going to do, expose the truth without me having to scream it. I had set the boundaries, and the loneliness that followed was the price I paid willingly. Thank you for listening to my story. What is your breaking point in a situation like this when the paperwork you once signed in good faith becomes the chain someone else tries to use against you, and the only way forward is to let the numbers speak for themselves while you walk away?